Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us at our first Art Matters Lecture of the year here at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. Before I pass you over to our Deputy Director who will introduce the speaker, I just wanted to go over some housekeeping for this talk. We are running it in a webinar format, so you can see us, but we can't see you. The talk will be roughly 45 minutes long. If you have any questions you would like to ask the speaker, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You'll be able to type in the questions throughout the talk, and we will read out a few at the end as time allows. Okay, well, that's all from me. Thank you again for joining us today. And now I'll pass over the virtual floor to our Deputy Director and Chief Curator, Ike Kang.
Hello, and welcome from outer space. This is Ike Kang. I'm Deputy Director and Chief Curator here at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. My alter ego is a Bernese mountain dog who you might see coming in and out. That was unfortunate, but I'll fix that another time. I'm so glad that you were able to join us. You'll have to forgive me because I'm really new to this format and I'm a bit nervous that I'm going to bungle it somehow. Fortunately, my trusty assistant, Elena, who you just met, will be able to override me and make sure that I'm muted and unmuted as necessary. But without further ado, because we really want to have all the time we can with our guest speaker, let me introduce her. This is Elena Fitzpatrick Sifford, and she's Assistant Professor of Art History at Muhlenberg College, where she teaches courses on Latin American, pre-Columbian, and Renaissance art and architecture. She received her BA from Oberlin College and her master's and her PhD from the City University of New York. Her research centers on race, representation, and cross-cultural exchange in colonial Latin American art, with particular focus on depictions of Afro-descendants in New Spanish painting. She's recently published in Ethnohistory, Latin American and Latinx Visual Culture and Art Journal, and she's got essays forthcoming in Emotions, Art and Religion in Europe, Africa, and the Americas, and Visual Culture and Indigenous Agency in the Early Americas, New Approaches and Interpretations. So I'm really glad that we were able to persuade Professor Sifford to do this for us. We're all living in a virtual environment, and I know she's heavily invested already in teaching online constantly, as so many academics are right now. So we're so grateful for her to take the time to spend an hour with us talking about her area of expertise. Also, you know, this season is very special because we actually have lectures devoted to Mexican painting of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, all in a row. So I hope you'll be able to join us for each of these very special lectures for Art Matters this season. So with that, I wish I could see you, but I can't because that's the way that this format is. You will have the ability to ask questions and we will address those at the very end. So with that, please join me in welcoming Elena Fitzpatrick Sifford. Thank you.
Thank you to Ike and Elena for the invitation and coordinating this virtual visit to the museum. So my talk today is entitled Casta Paintings, Picturing Racial Difference in Colonial Mexico. I wanted to begin with a quotation from a man named Francisco Antonio Lorenzana, who was a Spanish prelate and Archbishop of Mexico from 1766 to 1772. And he remarks on the diversity of Mexico's population as opposed to that of Spain. And he writes, "Two worlds God has placed in the hands of our Catholic monarch, and the new does not resemble the old, not in its climate, its customs, nor its inhabitants. It has another legislative body, another council for governing, yet always with the end of making them alike. In the old Spain, only a single caste of men is recognized. In the new, many and different." So he is talking here about the differences between what he is calling essentially Old Spain and New Spain, which is what is now modern day Mexico. And my lecture today is going to touch on some of his points that he's making about the different castes of people. This idea that in Spain they were the same, and in New Spain they were many and different. So my talk is going to cover the questions, including what are Casta paintings, why were they made, who acquired and collected them. And while I'm going to offer some various interpretations and answers to these questions, what I want to do is also to provide you with a view of Casta painting that offers no singular fixed narrative. Casta paintings are really fascinating documents of the time. They not only mirror, but they also actively constructed many of the notions of the period regarding colonial society. So they have a kind of layering of meanings that include a kind of what we might call a textual component of the paintings. So that would be the underscoring of racial and hierarchical divisions of the society. And also the visual component that hints at the abundance of the land. So this really makes the genre so compelling that we're talking about people, we are talking about goods, material culture, fabrics, fashion, jewelry, flora and fauna, and all of the abundance of the land that was so fascinating for the viewers and the consumers of these paintings. One thing I want to keep in mind as I move forward with the talk is sort of thinking about who was the audience for these paintings and who painted them. They really speak to the Spanish and the Creole, which is referring to people of Spanish descent who were born in the Americas, views of the colonial society. So they were painted by and for this particular audience, even though they display people of these varying different racial groups. And with that in mind, it's important to remember that the image that's created and that's communicated to the observer sometimes has little to do with the actual people. So in a sense that considering the depiction, considering the painting, therefore is reflecting on the observing subject, right? That this is a particularly Spanish Creole view of these different castes or different races of people. So I'm going to start off with answering some of those larger questions about the genre of Casta painting. And then I want to spend some time showing you a full set of Casta paintings, because this is really important for understanding them, is that they were created in sets of 16. So they were not individual objects. They were meant to be collected and displayed together. Portrayed racial mixing among the three major groups that inhabited the colony. So this is namely, as they called them, Indios, or indigenous people, Spaniards, and Africans. So we have sets of 16 paintings, a man and a woman of different races and their resulting offspring. And they're always inscribed with these racial categories that explain who is depicted or what types are being depicted in the painting. So I want to show you, I'm going to show you a full set of 16 paintings executed by the artist Miguel Cabrera. This is the most celebrated Casta series. There are over 125 that have been found. And this is the most celebrated one by Cabrera, who's a very well-renowned artist of the period, and who painted these, we believe, they were commissioned by the Viceroy of New Spain, who is essentially the representative of the Spanish crown in Mexico, who returned to Madrid with the paintings, with the Casta paintings, at the end of his term in Mexico in 1766. So the sort of stature of the patron matches that of the artist, and these really are the finest examples of casta paintings. So typically, right now you're seeing 2 of the 16 by Cabrera. Typically, the series would follow a specific progression. At the beginning, the scenes are portraying figures which would include one Spanish father with the Spanish husband with a wife of a different race. And generally speaking, these paintings that begin the set of 16 with a Spanish husband are meant to indicate the higher status of Spaniards. Even when married to a person of a different race, these earlier family groups within the casta sets are shown as of high status, well off, very well dressed, and so on. As the family groups become more racially mixed, their social status diminishes. And we can see that very clearly in this comparison of these 2 paintings, one with the Spanish father there on the left, and then on the right, a mestizo father who is Spanish and indigenous background, married to an India woman. And you can very clearly see, right, these sort of social differences between the 2 groups. In one, the family is, very elaborately dressed, beautiful clothing. The husband is wearing the height of style. This is actually the French style, because at this time, Spain was controlled by the Bourbon crown of France. So he's wearing a tri-cornered hat. He has this his India wife is wearing a clothing that is actually a mixture of both Spanish and indigenous types of garment. And then compare that to the one on the right where we have the mestizo and the India. And as you can clearly see, they are wearing very tattered clothing. The colors are much darker. It's much simpler types of textiles that they're wearing that indicates their lower social standing. So this classificatory system was, from an ideological viewpoint, meant to emphasize the idea of the supremacy of Spaniards. And one thing to keep in mind with casta paintings is that, again, they don't always reflect reality. In the 18th century in New Spain saw the increasing blurring of social boundaries as the necessary consequence of racial mixing, but also with changes in the distribution of wealth. In addition to the frequency of intermarriage, which legitimized these different interracial liaisons, the society in Mexico was marked by more frequent passing from one racial category or one social category to another. There was great economic expansion in New Spain in the 18th century, which allowed a number of families from lower social groups, people who were descendants of indigenous people as well as Africans, to amass great wealth and to essentially buy their way into the elite. And in fact, there was a practice in the 18th century where a person who was a member of one of the castas, meaning one of the racial groups that was not Spanish, could essentially purchase legal whiteness. And this was a grant that was called gracias al sacar, thank you for letting out, essentially that you could buy your way into this category of purely Spanish. So in a sense, the emergence of casta paintings relates to the elite Spanish and Creole societies' anxiety about this kind of, this ability for people to cross, to create a sense of order out of an increasingly confusing society. It was a way to classify and to render visible and stable a society that was in fact increasingly fluid. In addition, The paintings were intended to enlighten and amuse their audience. They are very entertaining to look at. They're visually stimulating. And they also relate to some of the ideals that we associate with the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, of course, is generally credited with fostering this acute observation and categorization of all manifestations of life. And giving impetus to the exploration of other cultures, promoting the kind of logical arrangement of these discoveries. But this fascination with the other isn't something that is, entirely due to the Enlightenment. It actually has a long tradition in Western thought. Now, thinking about who acquired these paintings, they, as I mentioned, were many of them were exported to Spain. They were seen as curiosities. They were seen as a way for people to access this land that was exotic. It was far away. It was seen as a place of great wealth and great intrigue. And so they were largely sent to Spain, and there they filled what were called the Wunderkammer. These were these cabinets of curiosities, and for elite members of society, it was a sort of mark of pride, right, to have this knowledge of and this access to the new world. I want to show you an example of the difference between earlier and later Casta paintings. The genre develops over time. And for this reason, we can't make a kind of single message or a single sort of conclusion about the role of Casta paintings. So for example, compare these two. Both of them show us a scene of a Spanish husband with a Black wife and their resulting offspring, who is called a mulata. But you notice that in Cabrera's example here on the left, there is this sense of idealization. We would describe this as a very sort of tender scene. You can see the father there sort of gently embracing the daughter as the mother looks on. And it has this kind of idealization about it. And that was another sort of aspect of Casta paintings, is that they really celebrate this idea of the nuclear family and the ways in which Catholicism and the sacrament of marriage brought about this kind of egalitarian society. But on the example on the right, which is a slightly later example, you can see that with this same racial mixture of the Spanish husband and the Black African wife, there is absolute discord that's being shown within the household. You notice that the wife is grabbing onto the husband. She is wielding a spoon in her hand. She looks as if she's about to strike him. And the mulata daughter is terrified, sort of grabbing onto the mother's skirt. And so we can't always draw uniform conclusions about Casta paintings generally when we see such contrasting messaging between the different sets. The way in which Islas, who's the artist of the one on the right from 1774, depicts the Black African woman is meant to show the kind of violent character. This is playing into these kinds of racist stereotypes around Black African women. And this idea that a Spaniard marrying this woman would be dishonorable, that would sort of jeopardize his status in society. So in other words, the domestic violence that we see taking place within the kitchen of this household is in a sense a kind of microcosm for negative stereotypes that are heaped on the Black African female body and projected onto this family. A note about some of the sort of material culture that is so fascinating about these paintings. The utensil that the wife is using to strike her husband was used to stir chocolate, which is likely contained in the earthen vessel that you can see on the counter behind her. Now, cacao was an indigenous product, but in Casta paintings, it is associated with women of African descent rather than with indigenous or mestiza women. The reasons for this are perhaps numerous. For one, the color of chocolate could easily be correlated with the brown color of African skin. More symbolically, however, chocolate was associated with sexuality, with witchcraft, and these were also stereotypes that were placed onto the Black female body. So in contrast to the kind of later Casta paintings, I wanted to show you an early example of Casta painting. You can notice this is from 1715. And this was painted by an artist named Juan Rodriguez Juarez. And the way that Rodriguez Juarez paints this family, again, it has that kind of idealization about it. And in his Casta series, all of the castas, regardless of their racial mixture, are shown in this idealized manner. So he doesn't show some of those kinds of negative stereotypes that we see in some of the later examples. So the kind of deployment of this family trope, again, is meant to create a sense of unity within this hierarchy. It's meant to, promote this image of domesticity that masked racial tensions in this case, rather than highlighting them in other cases. So this kind of uniform assignment of very sort of idealized settings, very luxurious clothing to all of the different castas in this series really distinguishes it from some of the later ones. And so luxury, and you can see the very sumptuous, very fine clothing, becomes a symbol of the privileged social and economic reality that of Mexico that the elites so desperately wanted to convey to Europe. And so again, we can think about these kinds of differing messaging that we can see in Casta paintings. There was in fact a lot of anxiety in the period around what was conveyed by the types of clothing that people were wearing because it was such a wealthy society. So in 1679, the Bishop of Michoacan complained about, quote, the notable disorder in dress, both for its scant honesty and for its indiscriminate use of silks and precious materials, as well as gold, silver, and pearls by nobles and plebeians alike. Right, so he's essentially, what he's saying here is that there's this disorder, there's this confusion, because unlike in Spain, where only the very wealthy people can afford these things, he notices that in all walks of life, that people have access to these very fine goods and very fine types of clothing, and that leaves that a sense of kind of, again, this kind of anxiety that people are able to transgress these social categories. Another interesting aspect that I want to highlight about Casta paintings is the way in which race is constructed. And as I mentioned before, the Casta paintings were, in a sense, creating and crystallizing ideas that were much more nebulous in real life. One of the sort of keys to kind of understanding the way race was being codified that we can see within the Casta paintings is that they tend to privilege the offspring of Spanish and indigenous relations over those that included an African descended partner. And so I'm going to show you that in this set here. This is by an artist named Jose de Paez. And if you follow the sort of progression, you see that it begins with from Spaniard and a Black mulatto. Again, in the kitchen, you can see her stirring the chocolate there. It goes forward to from Spaniard and Mulata Morisco, from Spaniard and Morisca Albino, and from Spaniard and Albino returns backwards. And so this literal, terminology returns backwards at the very end there when you see that the Spaniard has married this person who has only a small amount of African blood at this point, only an eighth. And then the resulting offspring is said to have reverted backwards. And you can see that the children there are shown with darker skin than both of the parents. And this was a kind of stereotype of this idea of the kind of lurking or hidden African ancestry that would emerge even after so many generations of intermarriage with Spaniards. Contrast that with how the progression takes place with intermarriage between Spaniards and indigenous people. I don't have every single image here, but you can see that from the Spaniard and the mestiza is half Spanish, half indigenous, is a castiza, and from the Spaniard and the castiza is created a Spaniard. So after these generations of intermarriage, the indigenous blood is then rendered pure, back to, is rendered Spanish, right? That the indigenous blood is essentially gone. Whereas with the African, in the African scenario that we just saw, you notice that the African blood returns. This is kind of similar to some of the notions of race that existed in still in North America, this idea of the one drop, right, of blood. And so we can see that there are differing notions and differing sort of values that are placed on intermarriage between indigenous people and Spaniards versus Spaniards and people of African descent. Okay, now moving forward, I wanted to have, as I mentioned before, the chance to show you a full Casta set, a set of 16. And this is a great opportunity to really see how the castas worked. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, we don't always have all 16 paintings. In this case, we do have access to all 16 paintings, although some of them have sort of dubious locations at this time, which I'll explain in just a moment. So these 16 paintings, as I mentioned, executed by Miguel Cabrera, were likely commissioned by the Viceroy of New Spain, and they were brought to Madrid upon his return to Spain. The first 8 paintings portray race mixtures in which the dominant figure is a male Spaniard. Each female and offspring, each woman and offspring, regardless of their race, is very lavishly attired. And so the supremacy of Spaniards is really emphasized through the family's sumptuous dress. Again, here you can see the Spaniard and the Indian woman and the mestiza daughter. Notice how we can't access the face of the Spanish father, where we can't see him. He has a sense of kind of power, a sense of kind of remove from us. The wife is wearing very, very sumptuous dress. Her clothing is a mixture of traditional European and indigenous clothing. She wears a skirt with a fitted bodice, which is a European style. She wears a folded cloth headpiece and a shawl over her shoulders, which is called a rebozo, as well as an apron of an intricate woven fabric and tradition that are features of traditional indigenous clothing. They are likely merchants. You can see them at their stall. They are selling very, very fine woven fabrics, some of them indigenous fabrics of Mexico, some of them imported from Europe, some imported from Asia. And all of the textiles are labeled. You can actually see the names of them that are indicating the different types of fabrics of the rolls that are heaped on in the stall behind them. In the foreground, there is also very prominently placed in the right-hand corner, a pineapple inscribed with the word piña. And the pineapple was one of the fruits that aroused great interest amongst the Spaniards. And so you see those popping up quite frequently in these paintings. Number 2 is from Spaniard and Mestiza, Castiza. And here, again, we see the Spanish husband and the mixed race, in this case, wife, all very finely dressed, very sumptuously dressed. You can see, again, the fruit in the foreground, this idea of the fertility of the land, the bounty of the land. They are at a hat stall, so they are likely merchants, milliners. And even the young daughter in her mother's arms is very sumptuously and fashionably dressed. You can notice on her left temple, there's a small black dot, and this was a very fashionable adornment worn by women and apparently girls in Mexico. It was called chiqueador, which is a very small cut piece of velvet that would be glued onto the person's face to simulate the appearance of a mole or a beauty mark, and it was seen as this sign of beauty. The next one has a very interesting story. This is from Spaniard and Castiza, Spanish Girl. Now, this image, the image that you see on the left-hand side there, you see it has that really glaring light on it. And this is not because I brought a poor reproduction of the painting. It's because this painting has been missing. It has been lost for more than 100 years. But apparently, it's been hanging out in a Los Angeles home since the mid-1950s. In 2017, LACMA hosted a show called Painted in Mexico that was curated by Ilona Katsu, who's one of the leading scholars on Casta paintings. And following the exhibition, she received a letter with these photographs included along with the letter. All of this time, this painting has been missing, and nobody knew what it looked like. There were no period descriptions or reproductions of the number 3 painting in this series. And in the letter, essentially, the letter was written by whoever the owner is from the perspective of the Spanish girl. And she writes to Katsu saying that, you know, she doesn't wish to be found, but that she's within a 2-mile radius of LACMA. And the only way that the owner sort of suggests that if all 15 of the other paintings, which are in collections in various countries, were reassembled, that this painting number 3 would be included. And this is, of course, for a curator, a very, very difficult task. And, you know, they made attempts to try and sort of track it down, but were not able to. You can tell from the photograph that was provided that it must be within the home of whoever owns it, located on a high wall, because you can see that reflection of the flash of the camera there at the bottom of the painting. It's an especially important picture in the series because it has really, really sumptuous details. You notice that the Spanish father is dressed in this frock, again, the tri-cornered hat. He's obviously a member of the, you know, sort of upper class aristocracy. The Castiza mother, who's the offspring of a Spaniard and a Mestiza, half Spanish and half indigenous family, is also dressed in absolute splendor. She has embroidered silks, delicate laces, pearls, and an extravagant coral necklace that she's wearing. She also has a very refined black lace mantilla, which is this veil that she wears over her head, which Katsu has pointed out is virtually unique in the Casta painting genre. You can notice that behind them, there is what's called a folding screen. This is the legacy of very expensive imported Japanese art that was very popular in the 18th century. In fact, the mother and father are also both holding fans, also imported from Asia. These were very exotic status symbols for the members of the upper class to own these Asian imported goods. As for the little Española, the little Spanish girl, she sports this beautiful diadem of flowers. She is wearing these crisp pink and gold silks, costly white lace, a profusion of pearls. Pearls were often symbols of purity. And they are, cast as this very elite, very obviously very upper class family. Perhaps it's rendered so incredibly lavishly because it represents this really important moment within the Casta series. This is a moment when, essentially in conquering the white culture's fabricated racial and social hierarchy, this, for the first time, a child miraculously returns her mixed race parentage to become purely Spanish in her identity. And so it represents a kind of homecoming to the pinnacle of this pecking order. And the family is dressed clearly for the occasion. Katsu has suggested that perhaps Cabrera lavishes particular attention on this because little is known about him before he emerged in the 1750s as a very important force of painting in Mexico City. He was originally born in Oaxaca. And his own ethnic identity is thought to be mestizo himself, that he was mixed of Spanish and indigenous blood, although that's still brought into question. Yet as he became successful in the competitive and racially obsessed capital of New Spain, he begins to identify as a Spaniard. So he, in a sense, was a person who was transgressing these racial lines. And so this is in a sense, the hidden remaining link in this magnificent Casta set that might embody his own anxiety over his own identity. Again, here we see from Spaniard and a Black woman, mulata. We can see one of the typical tropes for showing a person of African descent was to show them with extremely dark skin, which you can see is really emphasized here in this painting because it contrasts with the relatively light colors of the rest of the painting, and then is further emphasized by this very dark sort of headscarf that she's shown wearing that further emphasizes the darkness of her skin. You notice again here the fruits labeled in the front, this kind of familial harmony that's depicted here, this kind of positive influence of the Spanish father. Painting number 5 in the set shows us from Spaniard and mulata Morisca. The mulata can be identified, as she often was, by her tightly curled hair. You can see the Morisca daughter who's tugging at her father's jacket. It's this kind of intimate scene, but it adds a little touch of humor because you can see this male child in the corner is kind of taunting his sibling, using this pea shooter to shoot a little pea at her. Right next to him on the table is a split avocado, which is another symbol of fecundity and fertility that is, of course, also appropriate in a sort of an image of family. So again, it's meant to provide this sense of kind of orderliness, the guiding hand of the Spanish father within the family. Number 6 is also an interesting one. It is, you'll notice that sort of structurally it looks different from the others. The canvas is actually still attached to its original wooden scroll case. So it can actually be rolled up. And this was a very common way of transporting paintings across the Atlantic. So this speaks to this kind of import-export quality of the Casta paintings. This is the second of the 16 that disappeared some time ago. But it was eventually discovered in 2015. Literally, it was rolled up and stored under a couch in a family home in Northern California. It had been passed down through descendants of the mining tycoon John P. Jones. And once a family member, sort of unfurled it and wanted to look into it, it was greeted with great fanfare and eventually sold to LACMA. Again, you can see the kind of tenderness of the scene. The Morisca woman is gently sort of handing the child over to the Spanish husband. It's very striking, the amount of attention, again, that's lavished on the figure's clothing, a combination of a new Spanish, European, as well as Asian garments. You can see the kind of Asian silks that is worn by the wife. She's also wearing a rebozo shawl, which is an indigenous Mexican type of clothing, with a European style blouse with the very elaborate lace cuffs. Both the woman and child wear the very sumptuous chokers and earrings made out of precious stones. And the Spanish husband's clothing is also interesting. He's wearing a leather coat with these red sleeves. And this was a type of clothing worn by a special group of soldiers named the Dragones de Cuera. And these were, and you can see next to him, there's a very elaborate Spanish gun that were, has been identified as a specific type of gun made in Catalonia. And he also has a knife that's tucked into his trousers. The Dragones de Cuera were charged with colonizing rebellious indigenous people in the Sierra Gorda and in the northern frontiers of the viceroyalty. So his position in society, is reflected in his dress. In addition to these Spanish markers of class and occupation, he's shown smoking. You can see the cigarette both in his mouth and perched behind his ear. And a package of cigarettes nearby at hand. Tobacco, of course, was a staple product of the New World and yielded great revenue for the Spanish crown. I want to pause to talk a moment about the terminology that's used here for albina. In the 18th century, the birth of people who were albinos was hotly debated. They were seen as anomalies because they bore no resemblance to their forebearers. They were actually, in Europe, collected and paraded as human curiosities. Today, of course, albinism, which is a disorder, not a disease, is widely known to be caused by a genetic mutation that impedes the body from producing and distributing pigmentation. 18th century science could not account for the birth of albinos. And so a whole array of bizarre conjectures were brought forth to explain their very, very fair coloration that we can see on the albino girl. One theory, for example, argued that albinos were only born from people of African descent, which we know is of course not true. And the picture then, reinforces this theory. The Morisca mother, you'll remember, is the progeny of a Spaniard and a mulatto, and who is in turn the offspring of a Spaniard and a Black person, right? So this is this idea of how they try to explain albinism through this complex categorization. Here we see the albina who has married a Spaniard. And you notice, again, this kind of emphasis on her extremely pale coloring, these very, very fair eyes. Again, this kind of negativity, or this negative association placed on African ancestry, that their child is a return backwards, a torna atrás. And she is rendered as darker than her parents. The other interesting detail in this painting is in the right-hand corner. You notice this very large parrot. Of all living creatures, parrots particularly appealed to Spaniards. The parrots of the Americas are both larger and more colorful than the African species that they knew. So they show up often again as a symbol of this exotic and foreign land. Number 8, from Spaniard and returns backward, keeps in the air. This is kind of a funny one. It's like from the Spaniard and the returns backward, you're not quite sure what you're gonna get. Again, some dazzling costume here. The seated Spanish man with this very bright orange cloak, this yellow-brown jacket beneath with matching pants. He has a white kerchief on his head, this brimmed hat, sword at his knee. And the mother sort of very tenderly holding on to the child. From Black man and Indian woman, China Cambuja. This is when the categories become more and more sort of strange in terms of the types of names they're given and associations that they're given. Over the next 7 panels, you're going to notice that the colors really begin to shift. They become more monochromatic. We see more browns versus the more brilliantly and brightly lit colored images with the Spanish fathers. Previously, there were definitely references to fruits and vegetables, but these become even more elaborate and more emphasized. And the other thing that's further emphasized in these later paintings is their trades. Their means of economic subsistence becomes more focused. Likely these people are fruit vendors who were, you can see the array of fruits and vegetables in front of them. Number 10, from China Cambujo, an Indian woman, Loba. This family is shown at a toy stall in a market, and the father has tucked a little bird inside of his hat to give to the daughters. This little scene of sort of the tender exchange between father and daughter. And again, you can notice these kinds of darker colors that are entering into the more racially mixed group, but still they have, relatively fine clothing and elaborate clothing. So we haven't quite seen that shift that's about to happen. And we can see it starkly here in number 11 from Lobo in India. And this is, their offspring is the albarazato, which is essentially white spotted. And here we really begin to see these lower social hierarchies on display here. While the other families were merchants, the lower castas are often street vendors or working various types of trades. You can really clearly see this change in the color palette here. The people are, everything is darker, right? The figures are shown wearing dirty and tattered clothing. You can see on the husband, there's this visible stitching, meant to show this kind of patched together quality of his clothing. Rather than the masonry structures in the earlier paintings, you notice there's this kind of tattered thatched roof above them. The mother is also wearing a rebozo, but of different kind, not that very elaborate, fine garment that we saw, of the shawls of the more wealthy women. The rebozos were worn by women of varying social classes. Some were very fine, some were very simple. And indigenous women often use them, still to this day, to carry babies or to carry large bundles. So you can see her there, she's carrying a bundle using the rebozo. Her shirt that she's wearing is called a huipil, which is an indigenous clothing. She has this folded cloth headpiece, basket of fruit. She's likely a street vendor. The boy is helping her. He's holding a tray of zapotes, a type of fruit. He is assisting his mother. The lobo, and I want to mention that lobo, meaning wolf, we can see that with these more mixed castas, with these castas that were seen as lower status, some of the names become very bizarre. They almost become zoological with animal types of names. So he's literally called a wolf. He is likely an itinerant cobbler. He's holding in his hand a basket of shoes and tools. So more emphasis here on their kind of lower class occupations. In number 12, this is the albarazado and mestiza, give birth to the barcino. The mestiza woman, you'll notice she's wearing very simple clothing. She's wearing the blouse and the rebozo. She is combing through her daughter's hair. You can see the daughter's kind of grimacing. She might be picking out nits from her daughter's hair. This was a stereotype of the poor as being sort of infested with lice. You can see some of this kind of idea of this sort of inching in of the discord that comes with these, lower status castas. The albarazado father wears this kind of bedraggled looking jacket and shirt. And in fact, his pants are actually slipping down and revealing his undergarments. So this is a sort of uncouth sort of rendering of him. The boy holds on to a candle and a bowl of perhaps of beads. He might be a beggar or perhaps hawking these items in the street. The composition is kind of complex in this painting. You can see that the way in which the boy's arm, the father's pointed finger, and the mother's right elbow bring to the tension in the composition the girl's open right hand, which holds a coin. And so here the artist draws attention to money, which might be his commentary on the results of street vending occupation and this sort of need for survival for these lower classes. Number 13, from Indio and Barcina, Zambaiga. This one, in this one, again, we can see the very tattered clothing. The figures at this point all have a relatively similar brown skin color. And this family, the father is most likely a water carrier, an aguador. And these were people who sold water in the streets. This was back-breaking work, carrying these very large jugs of water. This was considered to be a very sort of low-class occupation. And here he's taking a break midday with his family, and they're eating tamales, which is a characteristic Mexican dish made of filled corn husks. 14, from castizo y mestiza, chamizo. This one is a little bit out of order from the others because neither the castizo nor the mestiza is part of the Spaniard Black African lineage that's been sort of playing out. What we're taken into is the interior of a cigarette maker's workshop. You can see they're here rolling cigarettes in the household, and the mother looks absolutely exhausted at this labor. They're obviously, again, a sort of a poor family. Tobacco, of course, was a booming industry in 18th century Mexico and provided huge revenues for the Spanish crown. 15, mestizo and Indian woman coyote. Again, animal associations with these members of the lower status castas, literally referring to them as coyotes. Here again, we can see the family out of doors. We can see the mother in the foreground is carrying a child in the rebozo, but it's obviously very tattered, and it gives us this kind of indecent exposure to the child's backside, right? So again, this kind of sort of uncouth rendering of the members of the lower castas. The final painting in the series is the Gentile Indians. And the Gentile Indians is meant to indicate the title that the family has not converted to Christianity. Unlike the rest of the paintings, where there is some rendering of architecture, whether very fine architecture or or not very nice architecture. There's some in each. Here they're completely shown in the wild. So there's this emphasis on the outdoors, right? So they're shown as living outside of the colonial society. They're shown as idol worshipers, right? They're not Christians. And this is emphasized through the setting, through the nudity of their dress, and of course, this inclusion of all of these feathered elements that were associated with the unconverted indigenous people. Now that we've seen all 16 of Cabrera's castas, which I made it through, and I wanted to close out my talk by showing you another example of a casta painting. This is by an anonymous artist. And it's the Albina and the Spaniard who produced the Return backwards. It's a really interesting example because it expands our notions of casta painting by showing us not just this kind of zoomed in view of the family, but instead this panoramic view of the city. And we can see the family just in the foreground there on the left. One need only to look at the Albina mother's face to sense the anxiety and the fear surrounding the revelation of her African ancestry through the very dark skin of her child. Keeping this idea that I mentioned before in mind, we have to be careful not to project this interpretation of the Albina on the actual lived experience of the Albina, right? Again, the castas provide insight into the observer, the artist, the patron, the audience, who were Spanish and elite Creoles. But what we can see is this fear in the minds of Spaniards who are projecting these ideas onto this kind of demonized and hidden Black African presence that can emerge from even the whitest of parents. In the painting, again, we can see the Albina gazing upwards towards heaven as her son stands dutifully behind her. Meanwhile, the Spanish husband stands guard, surveying the park below. And this is a scene of the Alameda, which is a very elite, very fine park in Mexico City that was essentially the place to see and be seen. So you can see within the park people sort of what was called on the paseo. They are promenading through the park in their fine clothing. And the idea here being that the revelation of her African blood will jeopardize their access to the elite space of the Alameda, will threaten their access to Spanish society. Meanwhile, the Spanish father peers down at the cityscape through his telescope. And art historian Mowgli Cabrera has emphasized the father's surveillance of the Alameda and drawn connections between this idea of surveillance and Foucault's analysis of the panopticon, right? This 18th century prison technique that allowed inmates to be observed without their knowledge, creating this kind of faceless gaze. And so there's this idea within colonial society of this interest in surveillance, right, of making things visible while keeping the observer invisible. So read in this light, the Spanish husband's gaze is an assertion of power and control that becomes tempered by the wife's revelation of her African ancestry via their son that may perhaps dismantle their privileged position. And throughout the scene, the power of the gaze is really paramount. It defines the relationships between the figures, and it defines their access to power. Much as the father surveys the Alameda, Casta paintings served as a form of surveillance of the new Spanish body politic. In them, we see reflected a multitude of attitudes surrounding race, few of which actually explicated the lived experience of the castas, the people of mixed race, who despite their sort of assumed position within the colonial pecking order, as I mentioned, were actually able to attain great degrees of prominence, wealth, and status, oftentimes through their association with the Catholic Church. Because while civic law denied the humanity, particularly of people of African descent, and placed them in chattel slavery, the church upheld their dignity and served as means of social promotion, particularly through lay brotherhoods and confraternities that tended to be divided along racial lines. When we see an image like this, then, we have to remember that we're glimpsing into a Creole Spanish emotional community of fear, of desire to control and surveil the mixed races of colonial Mexico. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. That was really, really fascinating. And I think it's so incredibly revealing in so many ways of the sort of deeply complicated history of race in the New World. And, you know, California also has a very complex relationship to miscegenation. And it's something that in the 19th century finds expression in all different sorts of ways. But I do think there are some questions, and I'm going to read them out loud for you. And thank you, those of you who did pose these questions. Here's one from Betsy Green. How do the casta categories relate to gente de razón? Do you see that?
Oh yeah, I can see the question here. Yeah, so this idea of like the gente de razón refers to this question of people with powers of reasoning, right? And earlier in sort of the development of colonial society, by this point we're in the 18th century, but early in colonial society there was a lot of discussion over how these groups of people, and particularly thinking about indigenous people and people of African descent, what their status was, what their kind of intellectual capabilities were, right? And of course, a lot of these ideas are extremely problematic to think about. But there were actually debates in the 16th century surrounding this. One of the most famous debates was the Valladolid debate between Bartolomé de las Casas and Sepúlveda. And Las Casas argued that the indigenous people of the Americas, they had reason, that they were equally human to Spaniards, and so that they were therefore able to be, fully converted and to live as free citizens. While Sepúlveda argued that they were not fully human, they were not rational, and that they therefore should be enslaved and should be completely controlled by the Spaniards. And so these debates waged. As the society developed, there developed essentially what was called two republics, the República de Españoles and the República de Indios. And interestingly, people of African descent were actually considered within the República de Españoles, the Spanish Republic. And essentially that meant that they were expected to, and there were certain sort of rules and regulations that were sort of different between these two. And while this appears to give people of African descent sort of advantage, what this meant was that they could be subjects of the Inquisition, whereas indigenous people could not. They were seen as more heretical because there was a sense that they were corrupted by exposure to Islam, whereas the indigenous people were seen as more pure and therefore able to be more successfully converted. So yeah, these ideas that sort of developed over the colonial period can certainly be seen in the Casta paintings, and particularly in the ways in which, as I was mentioning, that there is this particularly negative association with African descent rather than indigenous.
Great, thank you for that. Let's see. Here's one from Holly Chen, and it says, thank you for the insightful presentation. Is there any reasoning behind the genders of the children within the Cabrera Casta paintings? Is it meant to relate to the social status of the individuals depicted?
Yeah, interesting. That's a really good question. It's not one that I've really come across. You see, oftentimes you see, I notice that you tend to see when there's just a single child, oftentimes it's a girl. But then when you see two children, oftentimes it's a boy and a girl. I'd have to look further into that and look at it a little bit more closely. I don't know that anyone's done work specifically on the gender of the children and how that relates to the casta.
Great. And let's see, from Julia Stephen, in the last painting, to me, the woman is praying to the heavens, but you mentioned she is fearful for her position. How do we know that? And since the sun is dressed so sumptuously, doesn't that show he's more revered than in fear of his future?
Yeah, yeah, she certainly is praying, and perhaps praying for some kind of intercession on her behalf. I've been doing some work, some of my own research around emotional communities, and particularly this community, this idea of fear of the transgression of race. So it's pretty unusual in the Casta paintings, and in fact, this is one of the only examples where a person is shown like kneeling in prayer, right? And so for me, what that indicates is that she is, you know, praying for some kind of relief from this condition or this revelation of the son's ancestry. Of course, we don't know, right? We have to kind of, you know, we don't. That's one of the things with you know, of art history, that, you know, there might be different interpretations of this. But certainly the status of this family is now placed in jeopardy, despite the fact that clearly they have some degree of wealth.
So, but you mentioned that these are images that are invented for those who consume them, right? So are there written accounts, for example, of this situation and actual discovery through a child's skin, that suddenly you have African blood that you didn't know about?
Yeah, it's a good question you're asking. The paintings are, in a sense, as I mentioned, they're constructing this idea, right? And what we actually know is that these categories were actually much more mutable than how they appear in the paintings. And that people were able to transgress these types of categories. But yes, there are some accounts from the period that do refer to these types of, questioning of people's true background, and a kind of, and this actually goes back to Spain, where you had people of the Moors who were in Spain, and there were intermarriages, and there were people who were seen as being like hidden, Muslims or hidden Moors, and these kinds of sort of questions over the purity. There was this kind of obsession with this idea of limpieza de sangre, this need for proving that one is truly purely Spanish. And so there was this kind of sort of questioning of the legitimacy of a person's ancestry in these ways.
I wanted to ask you too about the status of these objects. So within the visual realm of painting of the 18th century, were these viewed as highly sought after, extremely valuable, relatively speaking? Do we have an understanding of how much they cost, for example?
That's a great question. In terms of their cost, I can't speak exactly to that. I'm not entirely sure on the market how much they would go for. I know that they were sought after curiosities, as I mentioned, to bring back to Spain. They are in the category of genre painting, so that's not the most elite type of painting. They're not history paintings. They're not, paintings of biblical scenes. So they wouldn't be. So for example, an artist like Cabrera, he was the preeminent artist. He only created one set of Casta paintings. He was more getting large scale church commissions, and that sort of thing. But it's almost like, okay, well, let me try my hand at this popular genre as well. And then he creates what's now considered the finest example of that, but he only did one.
Right. And that was also an interesting thing, just in being able to look at these paintings. Someone asked, by the way, about their relative size, their scale. But what struck me is looking at them closely individually is, in Cabrera's case, the level of quality of the execution. And I wondered if there is any tension as you descend, and sort of in terms of racial impurity in the sequence, in terms of the level of execution or the fineness of the execution.
That's a good question. Yes. I mean, the earlier paintings with the very sumptuous textiles, from a sort of, material standpoint, yes, they are very finely executed because of the amount of detail versus the later paintings that are perhaps they are a little bit more painterly, a little bit less with that kind of detail in terms of, particularly when you look at the clothing and how those sorts of details are rendered. So it's a good question to think about, sort of how much time he would spend on, the earlier castas versus the later ones.
Well, or even maybe the expense of the pigments, for example, because they are so incredibly sumptuous at the beginning. The first 6 of them are really lovely. Let me see if anybody else has posed more questions. From Joy Elizondo. Are you aware of any later, especially contemporary artists who reference or enter into dialogue with Casta paintings as they depict racial mixing in the Americas?
This is a very good question, and I'm sure there are. Unfortunately, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what artists are working particularly with castas. There is a poet whose name is escaping me, who's written a series of poems inspired by Casta paintings. These Casta paintings really have grown in popularity, and it's only been in the last 15 to 20 years or so that a lot of the scholarship around them has really emerged. I'm sure there are contemporary artists out there who are working with them. I'd have to look to do a little digging in order to get names for you.
And do you notice a difference in their reception in different parts of the world? Like, I'm just sort of curious how in Spain they're received and collected. I mean, in America, I think especially in Californian institutions, they've become incredibly popular. As you say, more and more people are very interested, quite fascinated, in fact, by these very, to us, really bizarre representations of ethnic intermarriage. But do you see, for example, a difference in the reception in Mexico?
Wow, that's a really good question, Ike. I from what I can see, there's really a lot of interest in them in Mexico, in Spain, in the United States. There's actually one Casta set that was produced in Peru, so there's some really interesting scholarship happening around those as well. I have to look more closely, really, like exhibition reviews and that sort of thing, to kind of parse that, sort of how they're perceived on either side of the Atlantic.
It's just that they're so amazingly blunt.
Yeah.
These issues of race that so frequently everyone sort of dances around very sensitive kinds of issues, and these are so in your face, blunt, as you say, in their messaging and in their address to basically a privileging of whiteness of the Spaniard, but whiteness and the color of the skin. So, you kind of can't get more literal than that. And that's, I think, maybe part of our fascination with them now, because it seems like they were sort of neglected for a very long period of time, right?
Definitely, yes. I think that they do sort of speak to this kind of modern moment where a lot of these conversations are happening, and we can talk about conversations in our own country right now around questions of white supremacy, and thinking about how these images from the 18th century were reifying these very same notions that we're grappling with today.
Well, yeah, talk about entrenched. Is what I often think when I think about the 18th century and so many notions of race that are really originating in the so-called Enlightenment. So as much as it was a scientific revolution, it was also really the beginning of many very deleterious things in Western civilization. Let me see if we can take one more question. Here's another one from Julia Stevens. Since these paintings are spread out among owners, is there an attempt to explain this wonderful history you've shared with us? Your talk has been very enlightening.
I'm so glad. Yeah, they are spread out, and as I mentioned, having a full Casta set displayed is really rare. It's really rare to get all of these paintings together in one room in order to be displayed. In fact, in it was 2006, there was a show at the Philadelphia Museum where the Cabrera set was brought together. 14 of the 16 paintings for the first time in over 100 years was brought back together. That was before the 2 lost paintings had been found. Still, no one has seen that one painting of the Española. It's hidden somewhere. So yeah, the sort of ability to gather a full complete set is really, it's not easy, but it's they have to be understood together. They're not these kind of individual works of art. They have to be studied as part of the set.
Well, I think that's probably as many questions as we should burden with you in 1 hour, a little over an hour. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us and to share your incredible knowledge of this subject. And we really do appreciate it, and hope to have you back again. Maybe you'll be able to join us virtually at the next Art Matters lecture. These are all first Thursdays, remember? So hopefully we'll see you all then. Thank you so much for joining us.
Looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everybody.